Okay, good afternoon. Now, what we've got here is we've got some basic information for Economics Unit 3. We're going to look at three different types of business objectives. Okay, so the first one is profit maximization, the second one is revenue maximization, and the third one will be sales maximization. Okay, so first of all, what do we do when we're constructing this theory of the firm diagram? Well, we're going to include several things. So first of all, we've got our average revenue. So what we do is we think about this in terms of this is the price that you charge for the product, it's also your demand curve, and it is your average revenue. So this curve goes on the diagram, and we'll put it like this. There we go. What we see is a downward sloping demand curve. As price falls, more people are willing and able to buy the product. Okay, so this represents an imperfect market. Okay, so it could be monopolistic competition, it could be oligopoly, it could be a monopoly. Okay, but it is some form of imperfect competition. Unlike this average revenue curve, this demand curve, where we keep the price the same no matter what happens, this represents only a perfect market. Okay, so for today's exercise, looking at this, we have an imperfect market, so one of those other market structures like oligopoly, for example. And that the steepness of that curve will give you an idea of what type of market it is as well. If it's a very contestable or highly competitive market, it will be relatively flat. If it is quite a steep curve, it will be where you've got barriers to entry or where you've got very big dominant firms like an oligopoly or a duopoly. Okay? Next, marginal revenue. There's a few really simple things to remember about marginal revenue. The first thing is it drops twice as quickly as average revenue. Okay, so as you drop your price, you are going to receive a lower marginal revenue all the way down to zero. And we're going to see that line drops twice as fast, and it will actually, this is one of the only lines that gets to zero. And actually, if you keep going, it will go further down than zero. You could get negative marginal revenue, right? You would never operate at that level, but you could get negative marginal revenue. This we're going to label MR. Now, those are our revenue curves. Okay, make sure that you've understood revenue theory. So the big difference between average revenue and marginal revenue is that average revenue simply look at what is the price you're charging for your customers, and as that average revenue falls, you are going to attract more customers. Marginal revenue is slightly different because we look at what additional revenue do we achieve when we add one additional unit. Let's just do a quick example of that. So imagine our price is €2 and we attract 30 customers. Okay? So this will give us a total revenue of €60. Now imagine that we increase let's say we increase our price to €3, and that means that we get less customers. Let's say we get 25 customers. Okay. Now this means that we've got a total revenue of €70. So let's just think about that. What's the difference there then? So the difference here is our average revenue is 30. Okay. Here, our average revenue has changed. Okay, we know it's fallen, hasn't it? Because 70 divided by 3 would give us, what's 70 divided by 3? That would give us 23.33. Okay, so our average revenue has gone from 30 to 23. But let's look at what the marginal revenue has done. Our marginal revenue has actually gone from 60 to 70. So our marginal revenue is actually only 10. Okay, and that you've got to understand the difference between how you calculate your average revenue and how you might calculate your marginal revenue. What happens when you add one additional unit or when you change one additional factor? So that's where we stand in terms of marginal and average revenues. Next, we're going to introduce our cost theory. So our cost theory, we have two lines for our cost theory as well. We have our average cost curve and we have our marginal cost curve. So our average cost curve is very simple. Well, let's put on the marginal cost curve first. First of all, marginal cost falls and then rises. This is basically what happens is when we add one additional unit of output, what is the additional cost that we have to incur? The most obvious example is something like additional cost of raw materials or something like that. Now, this is important. The reason it's important is because our very first type of objective can be identified when we add this line, and that is profit maximization. Profit maximization is PMQ. This is where MC equals MR. This is profit maximization. PMC. Really important. That's one of our big objectives when we come to work this out. Now, do we know where the profit is yet? No, we don't. Because first of all, we add our average cost curve. So we add our average cost curve here. Two really important factors here. Two really important factors. The first factor is, to begin with, our average costs fall as the business gets bigger. This is representative of what we call economies of scale. Okay, we can see that the marginal cost curve cuts the average cost curve at its lowest point, what we call the productively efficient point of production. Okay, and that's the second thing. The third thing is, what happens following that? We see that we actually start to suffer from diseconomies of scale. The bigger we get, the higher our average cost. So we're starting to miss out on some of those benefits of our economies of scale. So this gives us our next point. And what we can do is, where we profit maximize, we go up all the way up here. This gives us two things. It tells us what our price is that consumers pay, and it tells us what our average cost is, and that tells us what our supernormal or abnormal profits are. Okay? Next. So that's profit maximization. The next one is revenue maximization. So where do we maximize our revenue? Well, we maximize our revenue where our marginal our marginal revenue no longer adds to our total revenue. Just let that sink in. So our average revenue is this line. Our marginal revenue is this line here. And when we no longer add to our total revenue with our marginal revenue, this is where we will maximize our total revenue. So where MR equals 0, we have total revenue is max. Okay, so that's our second objective. Our second objective, which is revenue maximization. And you can see that's a much bigger level of output than our profit maximizing level of output. And think about this. If we go up here, this company would actually be making a loss. So, this is not really a viable option for this organisation. They would be operating at a loss if they were to revenue maximise. So chances are they're not going to do that. Don't forget, ultimately, if a company can profit maximise, they will profit maximise. That's an important factor here. And thirdly, there's something called sales maximisation, which is where we are pushing the boundaries and we want to increase the amount of sales that we produce. And this point is here. Exactly where our average costs meet our average revenue. So the last one is sales max is AC equals AR. Now, a standard business studies student would call that a break-even point, right? Where our average cost and our average revenue are equal. And look, we've got a much lower price. Our lower price will lead to more customers. We are increasing our sales level to as large as we can. And these coincide with our revenue maximization point here, but that's just a coincidence. That's not necessarily a given. What else do we need to know from that? Let's leave that there for the moment, and we'll come back and we'll look at a few other graphs that you might encounter in Unit 3
Thank you.
Economics.